Elena had never known true freedom. In the village, a woman's worth was measured by her obedience, her ability to be silent, to be pleasing, to be useful. The weight of expectations pressed against her like the suffocating walls of a cage, each whisper from the townsfolk tightening the bars around her. But Elena was not a creature meant for captivity. One night, with the wind howling through the narrow streets, she made her choice. Wrapping herself in a heavy cloak, she stepped beyond the village gates, disappearing into the white abyss of the snowstorm. The cold was brutal, an unforgiving adversary that clawed at her skin and stole the breath from her lungs. Each step forward felt like a battle against the elements, the snow swallowing her footprints before she could look back. But she didn't need to look back. She knew what she was leaving behind, a life dictated by others, a future already written by hands that were not her own. The storm raged, biting at her resolve, but she pressed on. This was not just an escape. It was survival. Her fingers, numb and stiff, trembled against the fabric of her cloak as she pulled it tighter. The world around her had dissolved into a blur of white, the sky indistinguishable from the earth. She could no longer see the village, but she could still hear their voices in her head, the judgment, the accusations, the cruel expectations. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she stumbled forward, whispering a prayer to whatever force might be listening. If the cold claimed her, at least she would have chosen this fate. A gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet, the force of it tearing her hood away. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, her vision blurring as the storm howled louder, angrier. She felt her strength waning, her steps becoming sluggish. The fear of dying alone in the wilderness was real now, no longer a distant possibility, but a cruel reality creeping closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body shivering violently, her mind fogging over. She had come so far. She couldn't stop now, but her body had other plans. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the snow, her fingers clawing at the frozen ground, as if sheer willpower could keep her upright. Darkness teased the edges of her vision, the weight of exhaustion pressing down like an iron hand. She had no more strength to fight. The storm would take her, bury her beneath its merciless embrace. And perhaps that was better than returning to a life she had never chosen. Just as her consciousness began to slip, she heard something. Heavy footsteps crunching through the snow, deliberate and unhurried. A figure loomed above her, the outline blurred by the storm's fury. She wanted to move, to speak, to cry out for help, but the cold had stolen her voice. Strong arms lifted her from the snow, warmth pressing against her frozen skin. She wasn't sure if this was salvation or another cruel trick of fate, but she was too weak to resist. The scent of smoke and metal filled her senses as she drifted in and out of awareness, the warmth of fire replacing the bitter chill. She could hear the crackling of flames, the muffled sound of movement, the rough texture of blankets cocooning her. She wasn't dead. Not yet. Whoever had saved her had taken her somewhere safe, somewhere warm. But who would risk themselves in a storm like this? And why? Her eyes fluttered open, her vision adjusting to the dim glow of firelight. A man stood nearby, his broad shoulders tense, his face cast in shadows. He was no villager. His clothes were simple, his hands calloused, his posture wary. This was no ordinary rescue. And as she struggled to sit up, she realized something else. She was not free. Not yet.
If you like exciting medieval stories, you can help us by subscribing, activating the bell, and leaving your like.
Rowan hadn't planned on venturing into the storm that night. The blizzard was merciless, a white void swallowing the world outside his forge, and he had little patience for foolish wanderers who tested nature's wrath. But something, a flicker of movement in the snow, caught his eye. A shape, barely visible against the howling wind. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping out into the cold, his instincts sharper than his skepticism. What he found was a woman, barely clinging to life, her lips blue, her body frail. She was unconscious, yet her fingers were curled as if still fighting against the storm. Scooping her into his arms, he felt how little warmth remained in her. She weighed almost nothing, her cloak stiff with frost, her breath shallow. He moved quickly, each step through the deep snow a battle of its own, his boots sinking into the frozen earth. The storm roared around him, but Rowan was used to struggle. The weight of another human being in his arms was nothing compared to the anvils he had lifted, the iron he had shaped. He carried her as if she were just another piece of metal that needed reforging, unaware of how much she would change his life. Back inside the forge, the fire roared, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. Rowan laid her down carefully on the wooden cot, his rough hands working quickly. He removed her frozen cloak, her boots, anything soaked through by the snow. She barely stirred, her face pale and strained. He grabbed thick blankets, layering them over her, but it wasn't enough. She needed heat, real warmth. Cursing under his breath, he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close to his chest, willing his own body heat to revive her. Time passed in uneasy silence, the storm outside rattling against the wooden walls. Rowan watched her carefully, his grip firm yet hesitant. He had lived alone for years, banished to the outskirts, unwanted by the very village she had likely come from. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could have ignored her, let the snow take her like it had taken others before. But something about her, her defiance even in unconsciousness, unsettled him. He wasn't sure if he had saved a life or invited trouble into his home. A faint sound broke the quiet. A sharp inhale. Her fingers twitched beneath the blankets, her brow furrowing as if caught in some lingering nightmare. Then, her eyes opened, wide, confused, searching. Rowan didn't move, watching as she took in the dimly lit room, the heat of the forge, the unfamiliar sight of him. Her gaze locked onto his, wary yet undeniably alive. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She had survived the storm, but something told him that surviving him might be an entirely different battle. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her, trembling too violently to obey. Rowan pressed a rough hand against her shoulder, firm but not unkind. "Stay still," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the door, calculating the distance. He sighed. He had seen that look before. Fear, uncertainty, the instinct to flee. "You're safe," he added, softer this time. "For now." The last part hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Who are you?" Rowan exhaled, leaning back slightly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't sure how to answer that anymore. Once, he had been a respected man, a craftsman, a member of the village. Now, he was simply the blacksmith, the exile, the one people whispered about but never approached. And now, he was her rescuer. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, time would tell. Elena's fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, her mind racing despite the exhaustion. She had escaped one prison only to wake in another. But this place was different. The air smelled of metal and smoke, not judgment and shame. And the man before her, this quiet, guarded stranger, was not the type to bend to the village's whims. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had not been so cruel after all. Elena quickly realized that survival in the blacksmith's forge was no easier than enduring the village's scrutiny. Rowan was a man of few words, his life built around discipline and routine. He rose before dawn, tending to the fire, shaping metal with the precision of someone who had long ago stopped questioning his purpose. She, on the other hand, had spent her life suffocating under rules and expectations. Now, she wanted to breathe. But breathing in a place like this, under the same roof as a man who seemed more steel than flesh, was proving to be another kind of battle. She was not helpless, nor did she wish to be. As soon as her strength returned, she attempted to help, tidying the sparse space, fetching water, tending to small tasks. But Rowan had little patience for unnecessary gestures. "Don't touch that," he would mutter when she reached for his tools. "You'll burn yourself." His words weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of someone accustomed to solitude, someone who had learned that the world was easier when people stayed out of the way. Elena, however, was not the kind of person to stay out of the way. Their clashes were inevitable. She questioned, he ignored. She argued, he walked away. She pushed, and he, silent, unreadable, only pushed back with his indifference. But indifference had never frightened her. The blacksmith might have been a solitary knight, a man who lived by fire and steel, but she saw something beneath that iron exterior. He was not heartless. He had rescued her. He had kept her warm, fed her, given her a space to heal. He had saved her life, whether he liked it or not. One evening, frustration boiled over. "Do you always live like this?" she snapped, watching as Rowan methodically worked at the forge, ignoring her presence as if she were another piece of discarded metal. "Like what?" His voice was flat, uninterested. Like the only thing in the world that matters is fire and iron. She expected him to lash out, to scold her, to tell her that she had no right to question his life when he had given her a second chance at hers. But instead, he simply set down his hammer, turning to face her fully for the first time. "You don't know what it's like to be cast out," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "To be seen as nothing more than a mistake that won't go away." His words lingered in the heated air between them, and for the first time, Elena saw something beyond the hardened mask he wore. Pain, isolation, a loneliness so deep that even the roaring flames could not drown it out. She had thought she was the only one running from something. But Rowan wasn't just running. He was surviving in the only way he knew how. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was an understanding, an unspoken truce. They were two exiles, two souls with wounds that had yet to heal. He had his forge, she had her will, and whether they liked it or not, they had each other for now. The storm outside had long since passed, but inside this place, another kind of storm brewed. Not of cold and ice, but of fire and friction, of two lives colliding in ways neither had anticipated. She still longed for freedom. He still clung to solitude. And yet, in the flickering firelight, she realized something unexpected. She did not feel like a prisoner here. The forge might have been built from stone and iron, but it was warmer than the village had ever been. Rowan might have been guarded, but he was not cruel. And perhaps, just perhaps, survival was no longer just about escaping the past. It was about finding something worth staying for. When Elena finally returned to the village, it was not the homecoming she had imagined. Whispers turned to gasps, gasps turned to accusations. The villagers did not see a woman who had survived a deadly snowstorm. They saw a woman who had spent nights under the roof of a man who was not her husband. In their eyes, her honor was as tarnished as rusted iron, beyond repair, beyond redemption. They spoke in hushed tones, but their judgment was loud enough to echo through the narrow streets. Her father's face was a mask of fury and shame. "You have disgraced this family," he spat, his voice sharp enough to cut through her resolve. No amount of explanation could change their minds. They did not care that Rowan had saved her life, that he had kept his distance, that he had treated her with more dignity than the very people who now stood before her in judgment. They saw what they wanted to see: a scandal, a stain on their reputation, an excuse to make an example of her. The elders gathered, speaking in grave tones, as if deciding the fate of a criminal. And in their world, that was exactly what she was. A woman who had stepped beyond the boundaries of what was acceptable, who had made a choice for herself rather than allowing the village to dictate it. There was only one way to make things right, only one way to scrub the stain from her name. She would marry the blacksmith, whether she wanted to or not. The decree was spoken as if it were law. Rowan would take her as his wife, and in doing so, restore her honor, or at least quiet the rumors before they spread further. It did not matter that he was an exile, that he had been cast out from the village years ago. Now he was useful to them. Now he was a tool to fix what they saw as broken. Rowan stood before the council, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had saved her life, but he had never agreed to save her from this. Elena met his gaze, searching for something: anger, resentment, maybe even the hint of resistance. But his face was unreadable, carved from the same stone that made up the walls of his forge. She felt the weight of the decision press against her chest, suffocating, unbearable. She had run from a life, she did not choose, only to be forced into another she did not want. The irony stung worse than the winter wind. There was no escape this time. If she refused, her father would disown her. The village would turn its back, leaving her with nowhere to go. She had already survived one storm, but this was different. The cold had been cruel, but it had been honest. The village was something else entirely. A storm of whispers, of expectations, of invisible chains that wrapped tighter with every passing second. Rowan finally spoke, his voice measured, his words clipped. If this is what she wants... The room fell silent. The elders turned to Elena, waiting, expecting. She clenched her fists, feeling the invisible chains grow heavier. Did she have a choice? Truly? She looked at Rowan, the man who had saved her once before. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, he was being forced to save her again. The wedding was not a celebration. There were no joyful songs, no laughter, no warmth beyond the flickering torches that lined the village square. Elena stood beside Rowan, her hands clasped tightly, her heart heavy with resignation. The village had gotten what it wanted, a solution, an end to the whispers. But no one asked what she wanted. No one asked what he wanted. And yet, as the priest spoke the vows that bound them, she stole a glance at Rowan. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his silence that spoke louder than words. Their life together was not an instant fairy tale. Rowan remained the same, distant, quiet, more at ease with fire and iron than with conversation. Elena was not content to be a shadow in his home. She had not chosen this, but she refused to become a prisoner of it. She helped where she could, tending to the forge, cooking, mending what needed mending. Slowly, the space that had once been his alone became something else. Something shared, something that no longer felt like a cage. It was in the smallest moments that things began to shift. The way he left an extra blanket by the fire when the nights grew colder. The way she brought him water without being asked, knowing the heat of the forge would dry his throat. The way he caught her wrist one evening, stopping her from burning herself on a stray ember, his touch lingering just a moment too long. They were not strangers anymore, but they were not yet something more. The first time he truly looked at her, not as an obligation, not as a burden, but as something else, was during a storm. The wind howled outside, but inside the forge, there was only the sound of crackling fire. She sat near the flames, lost in thought, and when she turned, she found him watching her. Not with indifference, not with reluctance, but with something quieter, something deeper. And for the first time, she did not look away. Love did not come in grand declarations. It came in silence, in shared glances, in the understanding that neither of them had chosen this, but neither of them would change it now. It came in the way Rowan, once so unwilling to let another into his world, found himself drawn to the sound of her voice, the way she laughed, the way she challenged him in ways no one else had dared. It came in the way Elena, once desperate for escape, found herself feeling safe. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time, she did not want to leave. The village still whispered. They watched from a distance, waiting for signs of failure, for proof that the blacksmith and the girl he had been forced to wed would crumble beneath the weight of a marriage neither had chosen. But they did not crumble. They endured. They grew. They became something the village could not understand. Something forged not by force, but by fire, by survival, by the quiet strength of two people who had refused to break. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Rowan set down his tools and turned to her. "You regret it?" His voice was gruff, uncertain. A question he had never dared to ask before. Elena met his gaze, unwavering. "No," she said, the truth settling between them like the warmth of the forge. "Do you?" He hesitated, then shook his head. No, and with that, the final chain that had once bound them broke. Love had not been given to them. It had been forged, shaped by hardship, tested by fire, strengthened by survival. And though the world around them would never understand, it no longer mattered. They were no longer just two exiles, two strangers bound by circumstance. They were something else now, something unbreakable,